Thomas Wolfe wrote that you can't go home again, and in a sense that may be true. As the years pass, neighborhoods change, people come and go, and we, as individuals, change. When we attempt to go home, the places of our memories may seem smaller, shabbier, different. As someone once said, change alone is unchanging. However, there comes a time when we need to go back and see what was in order to more clearly understand the present. Bethany has been a constant in many lives. The location has changed, people have spent a period of their lives at Bethany and moved on, but the heart, the basic foundation of the church, has not changed. Since its founding in the spring of 1915, Bethany has spread the light of Christ in ministry. This church has influenced and shaped so many lives. Yes, the years have brought changes, but Bethany has survived and remains the spiritual home to those who look to this church for guidance and spiritual growth. Rather than being overwhelmed with the changes over the years, we need to look at what these changes have produced, because as Anatole France has said, change is the essence of life. The Bethany of today welcomes us just as it has welcomed countless people throughout the years. Now and into the future, welcome home to Bethany. Bethany began in Atlanta on Bankhead Highway in an area originally known as Johnson Switch and later as Grove Park. The area was once called Fortified Hills because of the heavy fortifications built for the Battle of Atlanta. Grove Park, developed by Dr. E.W. Grove, who'd make Grove Chill and Fever Tonic, was a great place for families. The streets were planned so that every house faced a beautiful park-like area.
Grove Park, well, that's where I lived all our life. It was a great place to live too. I went to Lena Cox School, and that was off of Westlake where we lived.
And several people have asked about Grove Park and what it looked like and what it was like living there. And the streets were named after the builders' daughters. It wasn't uncommon to talk often about coming up from Emily and going around on Matilda, and it was a fun community where we lived. And when I think of all the joy that we have had coming to Bethany, I cannot describe it.
Yet one important thing was missing. There were few Methodist Episcopal churches. Few people had cars, so they had to walk most places or ride public transportation, and the nearest Methodist church was about 3 miles away.
And we lived about 1 mile from the church, and we walked. We didn't have a car available, and may not have even had a car back there in the early days. A lot of people walked to church.
On April 4th, 1915, family and friends of Lloyd Samuel Coursey were gathered on his porch watching the children play, when Alice Coursey exclaimed, "What these children need is a church, so that we can teach them about the Bible." Everyone agreed, and these 22 people started organizing a church. Alice Coursey named it Bethany, because Bethany was a special place in Jesus' life. Bethany Church would also become a special place for its members throughout the years. At first, the congregation met in members' homes. However, as the group grew, this was impractical. For 4 years, they met in a storehouse on Bankhead Highway. The congregation organized Sunday schools with 35 members attending the first classes. This building was sold in 1919, and for a while, Bethany members met on alternate Sundays at Fortified Hills Baptist Church nearby. The congregation soon began raising money for another church site. Children saved their pennies, and some members gave half their salaries. The corner store even sold apples for 5 cents each to raise money for the building fund. In June 1920, Bethany purchased a new church site and began to reorganize and expand. Then, on Easter Sunday, March 13, 1932, the church was destroyed completely by fire.
It was a white church, and it was very similar to the one that they have the pictures of now, the one that they replaced when it burned. And my brother Roy Coursey, I'm sure I remember my mom and them talking about it, that he save the podium from in the church. It was burning, and he ran back in and saved the podium.
Back on Sunday, March 13th, 1932, I got up to eat breakfast and get ready for Sunday school in the church, and my older sister, Mary, said, you can go back to bed if you want to. She said, we're not going to church today. The church burned down. It's on fire right now. And also, you have a new baby brother. You might want to go look at him and go on back to bed. And that's when Bob, my youngest brother, was born. Same day that when I woke up that morning, the first news I heard was that our church burned down and Bob Gary was born.
Because of the Great Depression, money was scarce. One fundraiser was the sale of brick certificates at $1 each. The church met in Grove Park Elementary until the completion of the new church. Formal opening of the new brick and stone church was on November 18, 1932. A 5-room parsonage was built in the summer of 1936. Bethany bought several other buildings for use by the Youth and Boy Scout Troop 61, which Bethany has sponsored since 1924. Space was still tight for the growing church, so in the early 50s, the church made plans to expand under the ministries of Reverend Charles Bolin and Reverend W.W. Twiggs. At this time, the Ray White class, named after a friend of many of the young people at Bethany who was killed in World War II, met in a converted garage. With an enrollment of over 500 in Sunday school, the new educational building was a welcome addition. Reverend Twiggs, who served from 1953 to 1957, later wrote that these 3 years stand out in my memory as one of the brightest spots in my ministry. The loyalty, devotion, sacrifice, generosity, and cooperation of the membership was great. The new education building allowed for room for growth and even had a small amphitheater for outdoor events.
Reverend Twiggs built the last unit built at Bethany's site on Bankhead Highway. I remember that Reverend Twiggs was well over 6 feet and he wore a size 16.5 shoe, and many times he would sneak out of the house before Miss Twiggs caught him and would make his way down the road toward the church from the parsonage in Grove Park, dressed in his morning suit, tails, everything looking wonderful, except for the fact he usually wore his white buck shoes with that outfit. And with a size 16.5 shoe, the children would gather in front of the church and watch his feet flash as he came down the pathway, and wondering how anybody with such large feet could walk without tripping.
For a while, the church did well, but near the end of Reverend Twiggs' ministry, the neighborhood grew steadily worse. In spite of the efforts of Reverend Clyde Smith and Reverend Dan Maxey, membership continued to decline as the neighborhood declined. Money became even tighter with less members, now only about 60 families.
So Ross would call me on Monday and say, how much money did you put in the bank? And I'd tell him. He said, okay. And maybe that'd be enough, maybe it wouldn't. I got a call 2 or 3 different times over the years. We got to pay the preacher tomorrow. We don't have enough money. So I'd call Ray Gary, and George Johnson, or Bilderback, and Ross, and call Ralph Corsi, who had a little business down in Atlanta. We'd see who could scrape up some money. We'd make a few middle of the week contributions. Put them in the bank, we'd get up enough money so Ross could write a check to the preacher.
Members began to dream of moving the church to Cobb County, where many members had already moved. The courage to act on these dreams came in the form of Reverend Carl McGrady, who became minister in 1963. Reverend McGrady helped the congregation make the courageous decision that if Bethany was to survive, the church would have to move.
And then the last pastor we had at Bethany, in Grove Park was Carl McGrady. He was also the first pastor that we had here at Bethany in Cobb County. I remember Reverend McGrady, his first sermon that he preached at Bethany. I think we might have had 55 people there that day, that Sunday morning, or maybe it was less. And he said, "I didn't come to Bethany Methodist Church to preach the funeral of a church." He fired us up that day, and it wasn't long after that we heard from our district superintendent, who was then Candler Budd, who said he had a location for us in Cobb County. And a lot of our members had already moved to Cobb County. So we began the exploration of moving to Cobb. But
in 1964, Bethany moved to its present location, a 7-acre site in Smyrna purchased by the North Georgia Conference. The church met at Russell Elementary School for 18 months, and the first church services were held there. However, if weather permitted, services were held outdoors under the grape arbor. The church pews and pulpit furniture and other items from the old church were stored in a warehouse and in members' homes. It was during this moving period that the church records were lost. Under the ministry of Reverend Carl McGrady, groundbreaking at the Smyrna site was on April 4, 1965, on Bethany Methodist Church's 50th anniversary. Groundbreaking at this date was for an educational building to temporarily house the church membership, Sunday school, and other activities until the main church building was erected. This educational building consisted of 9,600 square feet of floor space and was erected at a cost of $140,000. The building was ready for occupancy sometime in September of 1965. The first church services were held in the new building, now McGrady Hall, on October 3, 1965. Construction began soon after on a new parsonage on Hicks Road. The pastor had been living in temporary parsonage owned by the district on Bolton Road. Carl McGrady, who many view as the minister who saved Bethany, was forced to retire in 1966 because of ill health. In his last article in the Bethany Messenger, Reverend McGrady said, "We have traveled over some rough roads together and we have had our share of discouragements, but now the storm is over and we find ourselves walking in the sunshine of a new day." Subsequent buildings were added one at a time until the complex we have today was completed. A softball field, recreation, and tennis court was built in the mid-1960s. Just before the sanctuary was constructed in 1970, the area was cleared and the old grape arbor was torn down by the men of the church and Boy Scout Troop 61. The sanctuary was completed in 1970 and had a value of about $300,000, including furnishings. At this time, there were still 2 living charter members, Ralph Coursey and Gussie Gary. Reverend Noel Swanson was the pastor at the time. Reverend Charles Boylan, a former pastor, was guest preacher at the consecration service. In this new location, often referred to as the Promised Land, Canaan Land, or the Church at the Crossroads, Bethany began to regain members. Over 200 members joined during the ministry of Reverend James Weldon in the early 1970s. The 70s brought many changes. In 1973, the Women's Society of Christian Service and the Wesleyan Service Guild combined to form the United Methodist Women. During Reverend Herb Chisenhall's ministry in the latter half of the 1970s, the bell from Old Bethany was placed in the courtyard and ground was broken for the third and final part of the church, an education building. Shortly after Reverend Sanford McDonald became minister, the education building was completed at a cost of about $400,000 and provided room for future growth. Bethany continues to thrive in this promised land. In 1984, the Methodist Bicentennial year, Reverend Bob Lamford dressed as Francis Asbury and rode a horse across the front lawn to the church. This was a year of remembering the past history of our denomination. Since 1989, Bethany has been ably served by James Griffin, who came in June of 1989, and Reverend Charles Thomas, who came in 1993. During these years, extensive renovation was done to the church, including new carpet and plantation shutters in the sanctuary. However, the changes were not only physical, and the church was able to expand its mission outreach as well. Through the years, Bethany has reached out to others in missions. In the past, we have sent mission teams to Gulfside Assembly in Mississippi and to Haiti and Mexico. Our United Methodist women and United Methodist men are both active in the mission area. We have built 4 Habitat homes and taken numerous trips to Belize to work with the Hattieville United Methodist Church. Bethany also provides volunteers and food for Must each month, and each year our youth go on a mission trip. In so many ways, we are carrying on the traditions of the past and making sure that Bethany continues to be a church involved in the community through the work of members who care. Although Bethany is what it is because of the membership as a whole working together, it owes a special thanks to the tireless efforts and great example of some individuals who gave so much of themselves to this church.
There was George Johnson, who, if there was a saint of the church, is one. Garth Davison, Stan Lacey, neither of whom would like to be called saints of the church, but they are, whether they like it or not. You can't think of the history of Bethany without some of the names of Garth and Helen Davison, Mr. and Ms. Lacey. Dick and Flo Fields were members here then, and they were the youth counselors during that time. George Johnson always inspired us. Betty Ann Shaw was a tremendous inspiration in our lives. And Mr. and Ms. Fuller. It was a privilege to be in the presence of people who constantly held their faith up as the predominant thing in their lives.
George Johnson made this a happy place to be to begin with, as all the children would come up to Mr. Johnson to want their chewing gum.
Mr. George was affectionately known as Mr. Bethany when he was here with us. Not only was he, you could hear his resounding amens when an important point was made in the pastor's sermons, but he was also very active in promoting the Methodist Children's Home in Decatur.
And also there was Mr. Bilderback, who was very instrumental in getting a lot of the work done here on the original buildings. Two very good people, two very nice people.